All right, everybody, welcome back to Skywatchers Radio right here live again on psn-radio.com. And now without any further delay, and I'm sorry we had a little bit of a musical delay there. We had a little technical snafu that happened here during the break, which we had to fix. But we're back on the air, and without any further delay, we're going to have our guest of the evening on with us now for the rest of the hour. And this is a gentleman who I've been really, like I said, looking forward to having on this show for quite a bit now. And he's been on other shows here on the network, and he's a fascinating person to listen to, especially when it comes to this subject, which I am so interested in. Peter Levenda, thank you so much for being here with us on Skywatchers Radio. It means a lot to me personally because, again, this is, to me, one of the most fascinating subjects in ufology, the Nazi occult connection to ufology, and that's something that I love talking about because it's just so interesting to me. But after doing some of the research that you've done, I'm pretty sure that this is just mind-blowing and fascinating, some of the stuff you've uncovered. So, again, thank you so much for being here with us, sir.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
Now, tell the audience a little bit about your background, because I mentioned earlier that you grew up in the Bronx, New Hampshire, the whole 9 yards, and then Malaysia for some reason. I don't know how that happened. But what took you out to Malaysia? What got you started in this field?
Well, that's a lot of different questions there. I got started in the field really during Watergate for the most part. When I started really paying attention, I read maybe 3 newspapers a day during the Watergate period. And I was astonished at the names that kept cropping up because they all sounded vaguely familiar. And, there was connections back to the Bay of Pigs. There was connections to various CIA stuff, to the Kennedy assassinations. And all of this, was like I was seeing connections to all of this. And so I really got involved in this whole particular idea of a covert history or a hidden history in the United States at that time. And it wasn't necessarily always a question of conspiracy, but it was a question of connections between people, places, and events that you just wouldn't believe if somebody had written it in a novel, but really did show up in reality. And I was just fascinated by the fact that this was really going on. People like E. Howard Hunt, working as a Watergate plumber, but before that he was an action officer for the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then on his deathbed recently, of course, he said that he, knew about the assassination plot against Jack Kennedy. So all of this stuff, would just swirl around. And so I was very deeply involved in it. I was one of those maniacs with the scissors keeping clippings out of newspapers, No internet.
You had your own wall of weird, I'm sure, right? You had like your own wall of weird. With
pretty much, yeah. Pretty much. Oh, yeah. I was one of those people you kind of stayed away from, in coffee shops. So, I did a lot of research on that, and I read every book I could find, everything that got into my hands, and I talked to people. And then I began to realize that there was a Nazi component, to all of this as well. And that really got my attention. When reports started coming out about high-level connections between U.S. government types and political leaders and members of the Nazi underground and, war criminals who have been kind of sanitized for American, for the American diet, but they really weren't, nice guys. These were evil people. Some of them went on to attain high ranks in American culture and life. So all of these things really, struck me, bothered me. I mean, I had uncles who fought in World War II in both theaters, in Europe and the Pacific. And, there was this idea that the Nazis were this embodiment of absolute evil, and to see that there were Nazis living in the United States and that they were involved with, politicians, or they were involved in the military or in our scientific endeavors like Werner von Braun or Walter Dornberger, people like that. I'm thinking, whoa, wait a minute, I mean, hold on a second. What is this all about?
There's a little further than just being involved. I mean, Werner von Braun, by all accounts, is the reason why we went to the moon. I mean, this person is responsible for a big chunk of our space program, if not the entirety of the space program. So literally, these people weren't just recruited. I mean, they were integrated into our society, which says a lot considering we're dealing with the ultimate evil, which is the Nazis.
Well, yeah, they were totally integrated within it. In fact, they replaced other people. The thing that bothered me as I began to study this, and it's taken 20, 30 years of going over a lot of files and waiting for files to get declassified and then waiting for historians to come up with more information. Gradually, I began to piece together, elements of this, which is actually parts of it will be coming out over the next year or so in a series of books that I'm doing about just this specific aspect. And I was astonished to realize that the people who had jump-started our rocket programs during World War II, before the end of the war, during the war, American citizens, people who were very patriotic, and they were developing rocket systems, and they were, they had the same dream of going to the moon and all of that, were gradually kind of phased out of industry. They were phased out of academia. They were charged with being communists or being weird or whatever was around at the time, and basically were being replaced by Nazis that we were bringing in, from Europe at the end of the war. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm going across this, there's a huge, there's a violation of something that was taking place at that time when you had even Robert Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer is considered to be the father of the atomic bomb. He was the guy running the Manhattan Project, running the scientists for the Manhattan Project. And it turns out, they decided they wanted to get rid of him. So they found out that his brother had attended a communist meeting in California or something, and they used that to take away Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance. Here's the guy who built the bombs that we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and now we say, well, he's not American enough for us. We took away his security clearance and replaced him essentially with Nazi scientists. And when I saw that going on, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, what is going on here? Something really, really fishy was taking place. And this has happened, just all up and down the line, all various types of factories, corporations. You had Dornberger eventually going over to Bell Aerospace. And Dornberger, was running Peenemünde, which was the Nazi rocket factory. Right. And then down at Nordhausen when they started building these underground tunnels under the mountains at the end of the war. Here was a guy who was, using slave labor, having people killed, a really nasty, evil guy, an unrepentant Nazi. And we brought him over. He was at Wright Field in July of 1947 as the Roswell debris is being shipped there. What was he doing at Wright Field in 47, specifically the month and year that they're shipping Roswell debris? And of course, there was a lot of speculation that the Roswell craft was a Nazi experimental craft. So it starts to make sense that you'd have all these Germans in these very important positions in our rocket industry, including some really savage individuals. Hubertus Struckhold down in San Antonio at Randolph Air Force Base was a guy who was, the medical officer for, all these experiments that were taking place on live subjects at Dachau and other camps. He was just, Struckhold was this guy who operated on living human beings, to see what the effects would be of low pressure and high altitude and, lack of oxygen and falling into, ice cold water if your plane ditched over the Atlantic. All these things. He would use living human beings from the camps, prisoners, as test subjects. And now this guy we sent down with a couple hundred of his closest friends to set up the aviation medicine department at Randolph Air Force Base. And that's the aviation medicine for the entire space program. So I'm looking at all this and I'm just, I'm astonished. And I'm asking myself, there's got to be more to this than simply politics as usual, This is like a major sea change for the U.S. It's like we sold our soul to the devil, basically, to bring these guys over that we knew were capable of atrocities or were at least fellow travelers in those atrocities. Right. And we brought them over and said, here you go. Let's, help us with our space program. And the space program, people should remember, until the 1960s, the space program was a military rocket program. It was a missile program. It really wasn't a space program yet.
That's correct, yeah.
It gradually became a space program. Wernher von Braun wanted to go to the moon ever since the 1930s. He was in contact with our scientists back in the days before the war. So he really did have this desire to go to the moon. But until then, for the first 10 years or so that he was in the States, he and the fellow Nazi scientists were all there developing missiles.
Now, I remember hearing or reading somewhere that shortly after we did go to the moon, Wernher von Braun kind of went off the radar and started dealing with a lot of the black budget stuff. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, he dealt with black budget stuff, and he also started making some weird pronouncements about aliens, So von Braun started to actually kind of talk in a way about UFOs as if he was really acknowledging not only that they existed, but that they were here, they had been here for a while. Weird things that von Braun was saying. So we didn't hear much from him the last few years.
Yeah, he went off the radar completely for a few years, yeah.
Yeah, he went off the radar for that. I think he was involved in black budget stuff. He obviously had his finger on everything at NASA for a very long time. Dornberger was kind of shunted off to the side a little bit, and Dornberger was his boss in Nazi Germany. But Dornberger then gets involved with Bell, aircraft, and eventually with Bell Aerospace. He has a position on the board. He's a seat on the board of directors of Bell, and that was just a little astonishing to me. I mean, total coincidence, I'm sure, but it was Bell that shows up. Yeah, it shows up a lot in the assassination stuff around JFK, and of course, so do the Nazis to a certain extent. I mean, that's one of the things that Mary Farrell used to talk about all the time, was the influence of, the connections between Nazi figures and Nazi organizations and institutions with characters involved in the Kennedy assassination. So she used to focus on that a great deal, the late Mary Farrell down in Texas. But, I started to find out more, verification of this. It's like, what was this? Was it really enough to be anti-communist? I mean, if you were anti-communist, then you were a Nazi. Those are the only two ways you could go, communist or Nazi, in the post-war period. And so if you were anti-communist, you had to be a Nazi, right? You just couldn't be a patriotic American who was against the communists and the Nazis. You had to be on one side or the other. And I think that kind of polarization in this country kind of started around that time. There are a lot of people who hated the Nazis. Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, they had meetings in New York, and they did conferences to try to tell, the military not to bring in any Nazis under Operation Paperclip. They were actually demonstrating against it, and they were ignored. And they were therefore considered communists because of it, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt's husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was castigated as a communist and a dictator and everything else by extremists on the right side. And so you had this idea that, wow, you could only be one or the other. You're either for us or against us. And the Nazis were so anti-communist, and we were so frightened of the Soviet Union that we basically opened up our doors and said, come on in, help us out.
It's crazy. We flash forward now to 2016, and we're still having conflicts with Russia. Like, it's the Soviet Union still there. It's amazing. Sure. It's amazing how things have changed.
It is amazing. No, they really don't.
Yeah, the more that you think things change, the more they just stay stagnant, stay the same. It's always bugged me, Peter, the simple fact that these people were brought over so easily and so quickly integrated with our society and with everything that happened during that era. And in that same time period, Hollywood was being bombarded with allegations of communism, also with their writers, and there was, a lot of folks that got in trouble because they attended a party when they were like 12 or 13 or 14 that had a person who might have been a Nazi. And there was a lot of smoke and mirror stuff, I think, there to kind of cover up for what was going on behind the scenes with the Werner von Braun's and all these other folks. I think, even back then, Hollywood was kind of being used as a pawn.
Oh, definitely was. I mean, the idea, Hollywood had done a great service during World War II in churning out these propaganda films, right? Yeah. So they were there to stir up American patriotism. Remember, America really didn't want to go into the war. I mean, we were sort of isolationist in the late 1930s and 1940. We didn't want any part of whatever was going on in Europe or in Asia. That was, let them deal with their own problems. And it took it took the Pearl Harbor attack and lots of other stuff to get us really involved in the war, but we still had a lot of Americans who were not that gung-ho about it. And these films, I mean, starting with films like Casablanca, right, were trying to get us, in the mood to fight the Nazis and eventually to fight the Japanese. I mean, we made a lot of films like that. And the government realized the power that Hollywood had. And we should also remember that the people who took over and created Madison Avenue and created the idea of sales and marketing, the whole science of marketing, were people who had run the psychological warfare operations for Eisenhower in Europe during the war. These were psychological warfare experts, and I'm thinking of C.D. Jackson as probably the most famous. He was head of PsyWar under Eisenhower. He came back to the States and then became the chairman of Time Life, right? And he's the guy that eventually bought the Zapruder film and kept it off of the shelves so that nobody could see it until the famous Jim Garrison trial, the Clay Shaw trial in New Orleans. So no one knew the Zapruder film existed. C.D. Jackson's the guy who deep-sixed it. There was this whole thing that, we could use the same psychological warfare we did against the Nazis. We could actually use it against the American people. We just fine-tune it a little bit, and we can get the Americans to do pretty much anything we want them to do using the same, technologies that we developed during the war. So you have this, it's a continuum of people and organizations, and anybody who really wants to study this history will find all the data there. It's not a conspiracy theory. This is just a fact of life. And, authors like Christopher Simpson, for instance, in Blowback, and a few other books like that really went into those details back in the 80s and 90s. He was uncovering the influence that these psychological warfare officers from World War II had upon the American population and training us to think in certain ways about Russia, about China, getting us to get patriotic and to report on our neighbors if we suspected them of being communists and all this other stuff. So all of this was of a piece, and at that same time, our space program is going on, and the UFO flaps are starting in 1947, then 1952, the famous flaps over Washington, D.C., and, it went on and on from there. So these two things dovetail pretty neatly. So you've got Nazis on the one hand, and you've got the psychological warfare guys, and then you have the UFO thing, which is like blowing everybody's mind because no one knows where that's coming from, right? And because we're so paranoid, we think maybe it's the Russians. Maybe it's a secret Nazi machine. Maybe this is something that our enemies are doing. We can't defend our borders, right? These things are flying in over us, and they're doing whenever they want to, doing whatever they want, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. So that freaked out some people in the military who were not cleared high enough, maybe, to know what was really going on.
Now, do you think that? Do you think there is any truth to one of my beliefs that a lot of the UFO-related stuff is our own objects, the stuff that we're working on, and it's not so much aliens that are coming down all the time. Do you think that was even going on back then? Do you think most of the stuff that they were seeing back then were actually test objects that we were flying around?
Well, it depends which ones, but for certain, we were developing aircraft, and we're still developing secret aircraft that have been mistaken often for UFOs. There's no doubt about that. I think the U-2 spy plane was once, misidentified as a UFO and, stuff like that. No one knew these things existed. No one knew Area 51 existed.
Right.
So, I attended a meeting at one of the areas in Nevada some years ago, and there was a presentation by a guy from Area 51, and he starts off the presentation by playing the X-Files theme, and everybody laughs, right? So he goes in, though, the real story, the backstory behind what was going on there is really intense. I mean, they were doing a lot of intense stuff. They were flying pilots in from different parts of the world, different parts of the United States, rather. They had no idea. Their families didn't know what they were doing. They were flying all these test planes. They would go home and say they were, working in some factory somewhere, when in actuality they were creating these really, bizarre and very advanced spy planes. So there's a lot of secrecy around our own programs. And when that secrecy gets confabulated with the UFO secrecy, then you have a mess. You can't really entangle it, right? So you don't know who's telling the truth about anything, because they're keeping the spy plane stuff secret from you. That's a fact. So, and that means that not just the military is doing that, but industry is also doing that, right? Lockheed Martin, as a good example, it's the famous Skunk Works. So you have guys who are involved in developing these secret machines, and they're keeping the secret machines secret from all the rest of us. And then there's the UFO phenomenon. They're not identical, but they do kind of run in parallel. And some of the UFOs are our machines, and and vice versa. But there's also the actual UFOs, which have flight characteristics that our planes still don't have.
One of the reasons why I brought that question up, Peter, is because we read a story earlier, about how the government doesn't really think there's anything to it and this and that. But yet you see videos of like the Evrocar, and you see all these videos on the internet now that are kind of like, showing you what the government had back in the 60s and 50s and what they were kind of like tinkering with, which I think is just a magic trick. They're just showing you something they want you to see, while the real black budget stuff it's happening, and we're never going to see that stuff, those videos. But there's footage that's leaked out, within the government that shows objects that they've had in their possession that are UFO saucer-like objects. So, how much are they really not interested in this stuff when they're creating this stuff and working with other governments and stuff to get some other technologies going here? It's an amazing web we weave when these governments deceive, huh?
Oh, yeah. And, you can't be an engineer in aviation, an aviation engineer, and not be fascinated by the possibilities that UFOs present. Just from an engineering point of view, you've got to sit there and ask yourself someday, how can I do this? How can I make that work? How can I develop a craft that's going to exhibit those flight characteristics. I mean, those rapid 90-degree turns in midair at top speed would kill a human being. The G-forces alone would destroy you. So is there anybody up in those things? Are there humans, or androids or something piloting this craft? Or maybe it's being remotely controlled. Engineers look at this and they have to start thinking and they have to start asking questions. And some of those thoughts go into the creation of some of the things we have. When I was a kid, I was, as you pointed out in your introduction, I was born in 1950. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And when I was a kid in the 50s, which is, quite some time ago, I had plastic models of like the Evercar, right? I mean, these were things that people were coming out with, like model flying saucers that you made yourself, these plastic things that had USA decals on them because they were being developed by us. This was something that was kind of people talked about it in those days. It was open. And then suddenly in the 60s, the lid came down on that kind of stuff, right? Yep. And then you didn't have kids making model UFOs anymore, So the Avro car and all the stuff that was coming out of Canada and these attempts to duplicate what the Horton brothers, the Nazi engineers, were trying to do, creating their flying wings, and which is possibly what Kenneth Arnold saw, because his drawing of what he saw matches pretty closely the Horton vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not exactly a flying saucer what Kenneth Arnold saw. It's boomerang shaped, correct? Just for the audience.
A boomerang shape, exactly, which is the Horton design.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So it looked pretty close to the Nazi design. Mm-hmm. And there had to be, we brought these scientists over for something. We knew they were experts in everything concerning rockets. It wasn't just the design of the rocket itself. It was the engines. It was the propulsion systems. It was aviation medicine. It was everything involved with space flight. And high altitude aircraft flight. We brought these guys over for those reasons. They knew this stuff intimately. In fact, there's a story that's come out relatively recently talking about Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. There was a submarine that was captured at the end of the war, the U-234, which we brought into Portsmouth, New Hampshire, I believe. We got it off the coast of Nova Scotia. We brought it up, and there was all this uranium on board. There were a lot of plans. There was an entire Messerschmitt aircraft broken down in crates on board the plane, and there were V-2 rockets and all this kind of other stuff on the U-234. And it was going on its way to Japan. The Nazis were going to help Japan, develop an atomic bomb and, a delivery system with the V2. So the U-234 was captured, and an American in a fedora and a long coat and glasses shows up on the docks. He wants to go and inspect what the Nazi submarine had in its hold. And of course, there was all the uranium in there, and there was plans for the atomic bombs that the Nazis were working on. Well, this is like in May of 1945. And what most people don't realize, we still didn't have the bomb yet. In May of 45, we were kind of close, but we didn't have an operating bomb. Oppenheimer goes and visits the U-234, looks at the plans, looks at everything else, goes back to his work table, and, by July, we're testing Trinity. We're testing the bombs. And, it wasn't Roosevelt anymore, it was Truman at this time, could then go and talk to Stalin.
You can't say he had that much of a leap of knowledge just from that trip. Is that what you're saying?
It appears to be so, because he saw their plans, he saw their documents. He saw the paperwork that they had created, the blueprints that they were sending to the Japanese. And maybe it wasn't a complete bomb that he saw, but it filled in enough of the missing pieces that he needed to go back and to finish the job in building the bomb. It's a fact we didn't have the bomb in May of 1945. But after the U-234 was captured, suddenly we have the bomb. Now again, could be a coincidence. But it appears as though Oppenheimer did visit that U-234, did go back, did create a bomb, and by July we had a bomb, and Truman could tell Stalin and everybody else, yes, we have the bomb, we're ready to drop it, So that's what he needed. He needed that information to go on, have bragging rights to the Allies in Europe to say the war is about ready to be over, we've got a weapon of devastating power. It's possible the Nazis supplied the missing pieces, and what's really scary is that if that submarine had not been captured, it would have wound up in Japan. And who knows what they would have done with it in the last months of the war.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything coincidental here. I don't think there's coincidences involved. This is all planned and very well strategized and put together.
Well, when I wrote Sinister Forces, I wrote this from the point of view, as opposed to getting deep into a conspiracy theory, which you can get lost in the weeds and find out you're not really proving anything.
Right.
What I did is I took a different approach. I said, okay, let's look at it from a different point of view. Maybe there's a quantum mechanical theory of history, Like it doesn't have to be cause and effect the way we understand it in a direct line, but maybe it's not a coincidence, quote unquote. There's no, like the Kennedy assassination is a good example. As they say in quantum theory, a light wave, is it a particle or is it a wave, right? It depends on the observer. It depends if you're measuring particles or you're measuring waves. That's how you break down light. What is a photon? Is it a particle or is it a wave? I say that in the case of the Kennedy assassination and virtually any conspiracy, you ask yourself, is it a particle or a wave? So sometimes things are related, but they're related on a meta level, that we don't really consciously understand, but they are related. The timing of these events is so suggestive that you have to say that is what happened. Maybe we can't prove it. Maybe the documents were shredded. Maybe the eyewitnesses are all dead. But when you look at the timelines and you look at the chronology of what happened, you can build a very strong and very convincing narrative that this was the case, that the Nazis were that close to the bomb and we were that far away that when we got a hold of their documents, the problem was solved.
Peter, would you say and agree with me on one point here that JFK was assassinated because of this conspiracy in particular, more than anything else? To me, it's always been this relation to Nazi Germany, to the UFO phenomenon, and to the bomb itself. To me, this is why he was taken out. I don't think Oswald did it alone. I think there was a major influence from people way above the pay grade, if you know what I mean, to get him taken out. Because remember, he gave that great speech talking about how we shouldn't keep secrets, basically, and these are big secrets.
Well, yeah. Plus, he wanted to cooperate with the Soviet Union on the space program.
Right.
That, to me, was the nail in his coffin.
Mm-hmm.
No generals and nobody at NASA and nobody in the military-industrial complex, to use Eisenhower's term, nobody there was going to willingly cooperate with the Soviet Union and build a space platform, a space station, and go to the moon. He was talking about cooperating with them after the whole disastrous Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that. He was saying, we all breathe the same air, his famous speech, right? We all want the same things for our children, etc. Let's cooperate with the Soviet Union. I think that would have been reason enough for a lot of people to have wanted Kennedy dead. The last thing they were going to do is cooperate with the Soviet Union. Remember, that was in 1963. I mean, they were already putting people behind bars for being suspected communists in the 1950s all the way up to that point. They were rabid, where that was concerned. They looked at communists in those days the way they're looking at terrorists today. It was the same kind of paranoia. There's one under every bed in every closet. So for Kennedy to come out and talk like that about, let's cooperate with the Soviet Union. Yeah, right. Okay. He didn't have much longer to live after that, after making those pronouncements.
Yeah, it's an incredible tale of events that happened right after those comments came out from JFK. Yeah. And I mean, it's incredible the way it snowballed and ended up the way it did. I mean, in history would never know what really happened there, I don't think. Like, that's what, the Kennedy assassination is one of those things which is going to go down in history as the unsolved murder, which we're never going to get a clear-cut answer. But honestly, I really do not believe that Oswald had any part. I think Oswald he was a patsy. He was there, and he was because wasn't there reports that he was downstairs and not actually at the spot where they say that he was at the book depository. That he was downstairs like getting a soda or something when the shots went off.
Exactly, he was in the lunchroom getting a soda. Right. He was seen there. Eyewitnesses said he was there. Yeah.
So I mean, unless he can time travel or he's the Flash, there's no way he could get those shots off and be
teleportation.
Downstairs. Yeah. It's impossible.
Well, Oswald is a very strange character because there's so much weird about Oswald anyway. So it was easy to pin everything on him that you wanted to. You could pin anything on him.
He's the perfect patsy. The
perfect patsy.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what I uncovered when I was working on Sinister Forces back about 10 years ago, I was looking at Oswald, with a fine tooth comb because there was something about the whole thing that was bothering me. And I'm going through, Mary Farrell had I think just passed away previously to that, but she had accumulated all this information on the assassination, and she kind of did a correspondence to virtually every page and every character and every event. And I'm going through this computerized file of stuff, and I'm looking at, there was testimony in front of the Warren Commission by a woman who lived with Oswald, with Marina and Oswald in Texas. Hello?
Yeah, we're here. We're listening.
Oh, okay. I just got a message saying you lost the call. Sorry about that.
No, that was Crystal. She'll be jumping back on soon.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought it was for me. Anyway, so the story was that this woman is talking to the Warren Commission. Dulles, Alan Dulles, former head of the CIA, is part of this. He's sitting in. He's part of the people listening to her talk. And she's talking about going up to visit her in-laws up in Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, in I think it was August or September of that year of '63. And at that time, she has Marina Oswald. She knows Lee and Marina. They're both living in and out of her house. Marina's living there with her kids, and she wants to learn Russian from Marina, and all this other stuff is going on. She's a very famous figure in the assassination. Her name is Ruth Payne, and she's talking blithely about going up to Philadelphia to visit her in-laws, at which point Alan Dulles himself abruptly changes the conversation. I mean, he changes the subject immediately in midstream and has her talking about something else entirely. He derails that conversation. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, what the hell is all that about? And I start digging deeper and deeper. And it turns out her father-in-law is a guy called Arthur Young. And Arthur Young was the inventor of the Bell helicopter. And he left the Bell helicopter business at the end of World War II to devote himself entirely to a study of the paranormal. Yoga, ESP, astrology, all that stuff, right? So he's like firmly entrenched in this. But when I saw the name Arthur Young, I was taken aback. I was shocked because Arthur Young was one of these central figures in a seance that took place in 1953 with some of the moneyed heads of American industry. You had an Astor, a Forbes, a DuPont. All of these people, there's only 9 of them. And there's already 3 names that everyone knows. And they're sitting in a seance, okay, in Maine. This is very well documented. This is documented in so many places. And they're sitting in this seance and they're in contact with some supernatural entities which, as it turns out, are aboard a flying saucer hovering, in low Earth orbit somewhere. And they're communicating with these heads of industry and America's moneyed families and saying, we have a job for you to do. There's 9 of us up here. There's 9 of you down there. You're going to go and you're going to do great things in the world. I'm paraphrasing a great deal, but it was a long, very flowery statement that they were making to these people. And Arthur Young and his wife, Ruth Forbes, was part of this seance. They're a married couple. And Ruth Forbes' son, Michael, worked at Bell Aerospace in Texas, in Dallas, at the time of the assassination, right? Wow. His wife, Ruth, has Marina in her house. I mean, wow. Oswald never had a chance. It was Ruth who got Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah, complete pets. Yeah. I mean,
he had no chance. The guy was surrounded.
You couldn't get a better setup if you tried. No, you couldn't write this stuff in Hollywood. Put it that way.
And then Dulles, of course, naturally completely changes the subject so that Ruth can't get this stuff in the record. And then it turns out that Dulles' mistress, Mary Bancroft, was Forbes up in Philadelphia, right? They were close friends. They knew each other for years. So Dulles knows, oh my God, she can't start talking about Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes. The whole thing will be exposed. I'm doomed. Everything comes out. No. So he goes and he changes the subject completely. Ruth never gets the stuff into the record. So I started digging, and Sinister Forces really is based on essentially saying what happened, what was all that about in 1953. And with Arthur Young and with the 9 and with all of this, you have direct links into the Uri Geller stuff, the Israeli psychic who's bending spoons and all of that. You go back into the remote viewing stuff. All of this came out of that group, 9 people.
Whatever happened to Uri Geller anyway?
He's still around.
Still bending spoons or what?
Still is. Oh, yeah. He has websites. He's very active. He does, professional stuff for people. People hire him to find stuff, to find oil wells or water or whatever. I mean, I don't know how successful he really is, but he's still around. He's still active.
Interesting. The government spent a crazy amount of money, too, on remote viewing projects back then,
Yeah.
and especially in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of resources were spent into these things, and they kind of like abandoned them, which is, I always find that a little bit odd. Do you think did they succeed in any of these projects, or were they just complete failures?
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. I mean, I've talked to people who were very involved in the intelligence community during that same period who poo-poo the entire thing of remote viewing, think there's nothing to it. It was smoke and mirrors. There wasn't anything statistically significant. And at the same time, I talked to people also in the intelligence community who say, yes, there was something to it. Yes, they did find certain things they were looking for. I think a Soviet submarine at one point and other stuff that they actually were useful for. The problem with remote viewing is that it wasn't enough of a science that you would get 100% reliability on it. So getting actionable intelligence from remote viewing turned out to be more difficult than they had anticipated, although they did see, results. I mean, the results were there. It was just a question of how do we handle it, how do we analyze the information we get from remote viewing to make it much more reliable as an intelligence source. And I think that was probably part of the problem. But there will be people who argue that it was much more powerful than has been let on. There are others, though, who completely poo-poo it and say, no, it never really worked. I've been combing through thousands of pages of declassified remote viewing documents coming out of SRI in California and, CIA-sponsored programs, U.S. military-sponsored programs, all going up to like the 70s and I guess maybe the 80s. Eventually, the plug was pulled on it by Congress. They didn't want to have any kind of funding for remote viewing anymore because there was this sort of a witchcraft hysteria. The satanic cult survivor stuff was going on, and remote viewing looked too much like witchcraft to some of the congressmen who were sort of born-again Christians, and they decided, no, we can't fund this stuff. It's evil, it's satanic, or whatever. And so they wanted to pull the funding. But I've heard rumors, and I talk about this in a novel that's coming out next month on December 1st called The Lovecraft Code. I heard rumors that remote viewing had been brought back again during the hunt for Osama bin Laden, that they were, actively recruiting remote viewers. Not that it was their central, form of intelligence, but as an auxiliary form or an ancillary form of intelligence gathering, that there were remote viewers that were hired or recruited, for that purpose. And then after Osama was found, maybe they kept them on. One thing I want to point out, though, that's interesting, because I heard you talking in the beginning of the show about Adolf Hitler, did he survive, and the body, and then Osama bin Laden, and they didn't find a body. Interesting thing, there's more coincidences. Adolf Hitler supposedly committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, right?
Right.
Osama bin Laden was supposedly killed the night of May 1st to May 2nd, almost the same day, right? Although many years later.
Right.
Neither body was ever seen.
Right.
And Osama's was dumped into the ocean, right, according to the reports that we have.
Right.
Hitler was eventually, the Soviets, the KGB, claimed they had the body, dug up the body in 1970, and had it cremated and his ashes thrown into the river. So they both had water burials. They were both notorious anti-Semites. They both died on almost the same day, or supposedly died on almost the same day. There's just a lot of similarities between the two that I thought was pretty striking. When I heard about Osama bin Laden the first time, I thought, wow, that's a strange date to pick. It sort of has resonance, with the Hitler thing.
Right.
And I guess we're never going to see a body, and of course we never did.
Which I mean, how odd is that to not bring a body forward and at least have evidence that the entire United States, could see and say, okay, we definitely got him. I mean, to just throw a body in the ocean and let the elements have their way with them. I mean, how odd is that for us to do something like that? To me, that's bizarre. I don't think we would ever do something like that.
I don't think so. I mean, I imagine there must be photographs in existence of the body because they would have had to. They had to ID the body.
Right.
So they had medical personnel on staff that were, right there ready to make sure they really had the guy. So they had to investigate him. They had to look at the body. I'm sure they took photographs of the body of the corpse, and probably one day those things will surface. I don't know what the reason was. I've heard all sorts of reasons why they didn't want to inflame passions in the Middle East or do this or do that or, martyr him any more than they had to. So they gave him this sort of unceremonious dumping in the ocean, like, basically that's it, like dumping garbage, basically.
Right,
and they were going to take that approach.
Basically.
Yeah, they were going to take that approach to it, and which is, fine, I guess.
Which is
the Hitler thing, though.
Considering, not to cut you off, but considering how they ended up with Saddam Hussein, where they actually had almost a public hanging of the man.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
right.
considering the
That's
differences between the two, I mean, it's very odd either way.
And Gaddafi, for that reason, for that matter. Gaddafi too was very visibly murdered. So yeah, sure. Those were all very visible signs, but for some reason Osama was deep sixed. And the Hitler thing, I wrote a book about this called Ratline, in which I came across a Hitler survival story in Indonesia,
right,
of all places. And he's married. There's a photograph of him married, not just to a Latina. In this case, it's to a Muslima, to a Muslim woman in Indonesia, and he converted to Islam. This character, who many say was Hitler, had converted to Islam in the last years of his life to marry this Muslim woman, and then died mysteriously in 1970, very mysteriously to my way of thinking, and coincided almost within a month or two of when the KGB decides they're going to dig up Hitler's body and destroy it forever. So there was this odd juxtaposition of him dying at the end of January 1970, the guy in Indonesia, and then Hitler being dug up, I think it was in April of 1970, by Andropov, the head of the KGB at the time, who for some reason, God knows why, decided, okay, we got to go and find this body. It's buried in East Germany. I believe it was in Magdeburg, underneath the KGB headquarters in their parking lot. And he says, go dig up the bodies and destroy them. Everybody forgot there was a body there. What? Hitler's body? Are you kidding me? Go and find it. It's at this spot, dig up the bodies and destroy them. Hitler was Eva Braun. It was the entire Goebbels family and their little dog too.
Oh my.
So all of these bodies were taken out, even the dog. And they destroyed all these bodies, and the ashes got scattered into the tributary of the river Elbe, I think. So it's like, what? There was so much mystery around Hitler's body, his death, his supposed death, his possible escape. There's so much nonsense been written about it since 1945. I mean, the book that really settled it by Hugh Trevor Roper is the one that said, oh yes, we definitely know Hitler committed suicide. They tried to cremate his body. They half cremated it, and that was it. That's the end of it. He was really dead. There's nothing to see here. Move along. And the backstory of that is that Trevor Roper, a British guy, an academic, very well schooled kind of guy, an officer in British intelligence, was told to go. He had 3 months here to go and find out, and find the proof that Hitler actually committed suicide in the bunker. That's your job. Get the testimony that he committed suicide in the bunker. You have 3 months. I know you don't speak German. I know you can't interrogate the witnesses in Russia or the ones the Americans have. You can just interrogate the ones we have. But run around. You got 3 months. Here's your budget. At the end of 3 months, I want a report showing Hitler died in the bunker. And that's what he did. And that operation was called Operation Nursery. Like we're all a bunch of kids at nursery school. And we're going to take any story they give us, and that's what they did. It was a cover story. They had no proof. They had no evidence. And as it turned out, the evidence they did have was fabricated. It was faked. There were Nazi collaborators, doing stuff with dentures that didn't make any sense. You had prisoners of war in Russia, the Nazi prisoners that they had, giving entirely different stories. The whole thing was a disaster. So, for many years, I believe that everybody believed Hitler committed suicide April 30th, 1945, in the bunker. End of story. I believed that since I was a kid. I believed that until about 10 years ago. And then I started getting the story in Indonesia, and I said, no, that can't be true. And I didn't think it was true. But when I started to research it more, it turned out that an archaeologist that I know in Connecticut was the guy who had gone to Moscow to look at the skull that they claimed they had was Hitler's skull. And he's the guy who examined it and came back to the States and said, no, that's not Hitler's skull. It's the skull of a woman. And it's the wrong age even to be Eva Braun. And, I don't know who they think they're kidding, but it's just not true. And he's the state archaeologist of Connecticut. I mean, he's a reputable archaeologist. He's not just some guy they picked up, right? So here's this guy who's done a lot of very good work in his field, coming back and saying, no, I'm sorry, that's not Hitler's skull. They don't have Hitler's body. So, what are you going to do? So here I am now, my entire worldview completely shattered. I'm thinking, well, if Hitler escaped, then, now what? What's on the 18.5 minutes of the Oval Office tapes? Come on, people.
I think Hitler really did escape to Antarctica, and he's in the Hollow Earth or somewhere. That's really what happened.
He's in the Hollow Earth with the UFOs, for sure.
But,
at this point, I'll believe it at this point.
I linked you here the article that I had seen a while back, not too long ago, but I read it a couple of months ago, which shows the image of Hitler and how he looked later on. And it says that he fled to Argentina originally. And it shows, if you go scroll down, you'll see the image of him and his future wife in 1984. So he lived a long time, if this is true.
Well, that's about 100 years, yeah.
Yeah, he lived a good, healthy life, this scumbag.
Yeah, if that's true. I mean, there was a lot. I mean, Hoover believed that Hitler had escaped. I mean, Hoover kept a open file on Adolf Hitler through the 60s. I mean, he was never convinced that Hitler had died in the bunker. And few people in the high levels of government really did believe it. They thought it was just a story. So they kind of ignored it. I mean, it's like, yeah, whatever. So Hoover thought it was. His agents were always reporting. I have all those files, and anybody can if they go to the FBI site. You can download all that stuff and take a look at it yourself. I mean, it's all there. Mm-hmm. But the Indonesia stuff was really weird because in my book, in Ratline, I have photographs of that guy with his wife, and he looks identical to the early pictures of Hitler when Hitler was a corporal in the German army during World War I. It's a remarkable, likeness. And if Hitler had been sick, if he had lost weight, he would have looked pretty much like he looked when he was a skinny 20-year-old in the German army during World War I. So it's there was something to it. And I've seen copies of the passport that he used to get into Indonesia. And those passport photos and the year that he was born and the place he was born, they were both Austrian. The guy in Indonesia and Hitler were both Austrians. They were both born around the same year, exactly the same height, same handlebar, sort of Charlie Chaplin mustache, the whole thing, And so it made me really wonder if maybe this really was, somebody who was using faked papers to get into Indonesia, which would have been the safest place for him. I don't think Hitler would have gone to Argentina. I think, anybody would have dropped a dime on him. He didn't trust his people anymore. His people tried to kill him in July of 1944. After the D-Day invasion. So there was Operation Valkyrie. His generals were against him. He was hiding out. He didn't know who to trust. Would he have gone to Argentina like All Is Forgiven and hang out with Mengele and Barbie and everybody else? I mean, I don't know. I think he would have gone someplace where he would really have been safe.
I think people with the kind of wealth, though, that Hitler and like Osama bin Laden would have, would be able to buy their passage somewhere discreet and safe. So, I mean, whether it's Argentina or anywhere in the world, I think, the kind of power that he wielded at the time, I'm pretty sure he had a fail-safe program ready for when, it hit the fan and he had to disappear. Not only that, we know for a fact that not only Hitler, but bin Laden had him, Saddam Hussein had him. All these folks in major political power, especially dictators, have lookalikes. Dozens of lookalikes just for these kind of scenarios, and it would not shock me at all if what we ended up seeing, the body that we saw, was that of a lookalike that was shot and killed, and they said he committed suicide.
But that's actually part of that is what happened. The Soviet Union released a photograph showing the Russian soldiers around a body they said was Hitler. As it turned out, it was one of the doubles. Right. It was revealed to be a double. They knew it was a double. Hitler had at least two doubles that we know of. We know their names. There might have been more. Argentina, I think, to me, was problematic only because all the Nazis were in Argentina. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Israel had gone and gotten Eichmann out of Buenos Aires, right, around 1960. So I think that Hitler would have been scared to death that the Israelis would come looking for him. I mean, he was a much bigger target than Eichmann. So if I was Hitler, would I hang out with a bunch of my fellow Nazis that I couldn't trust, who maybe could make a couple $100,000 if they, told Mossad where I was living? So I don't know. I don't know if Argentina made sense. I mean, I followed all those stories, of course, and they're very suggestive. And he obviously had escape routes planned. I mean,
had to.
What's his name? The guy who took over from Hitler for like a week after Hitler's supposed suicide, the admiral. said that we've places set up for him. He made speeches to naval cadets before the war ended, saying the Führer will be taken care of. We've got locations. There was the Eden Hotel in Argentina that I wrote about, which was run by financiers of the Third Reich, and that was a remote hotel in Argentina where he was welcomed at any time to hang out if he was on the run. All of this makes sense, and yet wouldn't he have been safer in a Muslim country on the other side of the world where, Mossad would have had a very hard time penetrating? I mean, it was easier to get into Argentina because ethnicity, language and everything else. But Indonesia would have been very hard for anybody to snatch Hitler out of there, or a country like that, someplace in Asia. And during my research, I found a lot of Nazis had made it to Asia. And Hitler's closest friend in the world, up until the last day in the bunker, was a guy called Walter Hewel, or Havel, Hewel. Walter Havel was one of the guys who marched with Hitler during the beer hall putsch in 1923 when he was just a kid. This guy was pro-Hitler from the very beginning, was arrested with Hitler, was in jail, got out of jail, and then eventually wound up in Indonesia, running tea plantations and stuff and setting up an entire elaborate Nazi party apparatus throughout the Indonesian archipelago. And again, all very well documented. Once Hitler comes to power, Havel is called back, and he serves as kind of an ambassador at large for Hitler. And Hitler loves having the guy around, and he's one of the last people to leave the bunker. And they called him Surabaya Wali because he kept talking about Surabaya, which is in Indonesia. It's a famous port city. And because Wali had all these jokes and all these stories, these exotic stories about Indonesia, these are the last stories that Hitler was hearing in 1945, in April of 45. We don't know what happened to Havel either. There's no body, there's no corpse of Walter Havel. So, there's an Indonesian connection there somehow.
No, I definitely agree that it is a better safe haven for Hitler, by all means, in every aspect than Argentina. But still, regardless of where he ended up, I do believe they're almost 100% that he survived and disappeared somewhere.
I'm tending towards that. I'm tending towards that belief myself.
Yeah.
I don't think he was as sick as he was portrayed. He was being treated by a quack doctor, Theodore Morel, who was giving him cocaine and all sorts of wild.
Yeah. Which is ironic, by the way, because Osama bin Laden, of course, he was under dialysis, and he was not healthy himself. So here we have a repeating theme.
Apparently,
where these dictators are all sick and going through the medical issues.
Well, Morel was sort of fired like 2 weeks before the end of April 45 by Hitler and told to leave. And Hitler started to get better. His health began to improve once Morel left, because Morel was keeping him doped up, basically.
Yeah, makes sense.
He was keeping him he was a quack doctor. He was selling stuff. He's selling his own medicines and stuff. So he had Hitler sort of doped up during this period. People say Hitler had Parkinson's. The problem is he was never diagnosed by any doctor as having Parkinson's. Nobody actually examined him except Morel, and Morel would never have said Parkinson's. So we don't know if Hitler was really that sick or not. But my theory, and it's just a theory, it's a speculation, is that no one knew about Eva Braun either. We didn't know about Eva Braun till the end of the war.
Right.
So Eva Braun was this mysterious figure that he supposedly married the day before they both committed suicide.
Right.
Wouldn't it have been a great escape attempt to have Hitler with his mustache shaved off, right, sitting in a wheelchair being pushed by a blonde nurse, through the rubble of Berlin and getting him out that way? No one is looking for a couple. They were looking for Hitler. No one knew he was married. No one knew that Eva Braun existed. She was kept a secret from the German people. Hitler didn't want anybody to know about her. Just the high level staff knew about it. No one's expecting Hitler had a wife.
Right.
Much less one, much younger, and the sort of blonde, blue-eyed type is, put her in a nurse's uniform and have her push the wheelchair. No one's going to stop and say, "Is this Hitler?"
Right.
So they could have gotten out that way.
That makes perfect sense.
Wow.
Completely
That
does.
really does.
Peter,
I've got a quick question for you.
Go ahead.
Actually, go ahead, Jack, because I'm going to take the conversation in a whole other direction.
No, go ahead. My question would be a lot sillier. Go ahead.
Okay. My question, because we've kind of covered, the basis of the scientists that came over to work on the UFOs and, possibly, had something to do with the atomic bomb and this, that, and the other. So my question to you is, in your research, what, as far as the occult goes, what were the Nazis really interested in? That you're reading? Was it a wide variety of things like the remote viewing and, this, that, and the other, or were they kind of really interested in just one aspect of it?
Well, when you say the Nazis, it really was the SS was the real, repository for all this occult lore. Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, was a fanatic about all this stuff. He had a personal astrologer. He had his masseur was a guy also involved in New Age stuff and New Age remedies and that sort of thing. But Himmler himself believed in reincarnation. He believed in ritual magic. He believed in the powers of meditation and of aligning oneself with one's ancestors. He had a guy on his staff called Weistor, who was a former mental patient, but who was a man who was a mystic and claimed that he had complete memory of all of his lives going back 10,000 years, and therefore could tell Himmler exactly what the Aryan people, the German people, the Teutonic people were doing, 5,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. He could recreate the religions of the time and all this other stuff, and for a long time Himmler kind of believed him. Another guy on Himmler's personal staff was Otto Rahn. And Otto Rahn was the guy looking for the Holy Grail on Himmler's behalf.
Oh, wow.
And that's very well documented. Otto Rahn wrote a number of books which have been translated. They're in English now. When I started doing the research, they weren't, so I had a devil of a time finding them. But this was a very well-educated guy as well. He was a scholar, and he believed in all of this. A lot of the stuff we have today, a lot of the sort of Da Vinci Code stuff, the Knights Templar, the Cathars, the Holy Grail, all that came out of Otto Rahn. That was his bailiwick. That was what he was doing back in the 1930s and the 1940s. He joined the SS, basically to become part of Himmler's personal staff. And at some point, very early on in the war, he died mysteriously. He died during a so-called mountain climbing expedition. The mountain he was climbing was not much more than a hill, and it was said he died of exposure, it was in the spring. There's a lot of, sort of stupid stories about how Otto Rahn died. None of them really make a lot of sense. But he was in the SS. It was rumored he was homosexual and may have been killed because of that. Himmler had no toleration at all for homosexuality, which was pretty funny considering the SS. Some of its rituals, which were extremely gay.
Yeah.
And it's just really weird, that there was this guy who was, exactly on Himmler's wavelength when all these ancient religions are concerned, and all of the occult practices and the magical practices that predated Christianity. And here was a guy that actually was looking for the Grail and spent a lot of time in the south of France near Montségur, which is where the Cathar, last Cathar stronghold. Spent a lot of time down there. Kind of an eccentric guy, and yet would be, basically executed by the SS at some point, even after he's published these books and he's done speeches on behalf of Himmler and all the rest of it. So you have the Otto Rahn connection. You have the Weistor connection. Weistor is the guy who designed the Death's Head ring for the SS with all the mystical runes on it. I mean, that's how powerful he was. And then you had the Tibet expedition, the very famous 1938 expedition that Himmler financed. He sent the SS to Tibet, to find out what ancient mystical secrets they had. So they went to Tibet. I've seen the film footage. I've seen the photography. It's tremendous stuff, material they collected, ethnographic, material, anthropological stuff, and archaeological stuff. They came back with all sorts of artifacts and books from Tibet. And one of the anthropologists, who was a member of that expedition, then later became one of Nazi Germany's war criminals. Here's a guy who spent, months at the feet of the lamas in Tibet, in Lhasa and Shigatse and all these other places in Tibet, had unparalleled access to Tibetan culture, religion, all the rest of it, which we tend to think of in very high spiritual terms. This guy comes back, Bruno Beger was his name. He came back to Germany, and then during the war, he basically set up a museum, or was building a museum of anthropology, and he needed skeletal material. He needed skeletons, right? So he would go to the camps and say, he would look at all the prisoners and say, I want this one, and this one. Be careful not to damage any of the skeletal material when you kill him, right?
Oh my
So
God.
people would be killed.
Horrible.
More than 80 people were murdered for this reason. More than 80 people were murdered to supply him with skeletons for this museum of anthropology.
Unreal.
Yeah. And this guy was never really prosecuted for the war. He lived until a ripe old age in Germany. And he remained a friend of Tibet and, the Dalai Lama. He had his photograph taken with the Dalai Lama later on in his life, long after the war was over. He even wrote a very beautiful depiction of what life was like in Lhasa back in 1938 and 39, and then abruptly it was taken down. People started to complain, this is a war criminal. You don't need to be associated with this, Mr. Dalai Lama, So it was just so weird, the whole connection between Tibet and the Nazis, and this is part of their occult fascination. They were, it was sort of theosophy was part of this. This was this idea of different races having different spiritual powers and capabilities that other races did not have. It's when you're asking the question about the Nazis and occultism, it's a broad subject. They were involved in all sorts of things. They were interested in everything. And it was used against them, quite frankly. The British intelligence began developing these fake Nostradamus prophecies, right? That they claimed were Nostradamus prophecies, prophesying the end of the war, turning out really badly for Germany. And they would drop these prophecies, these pamphlets all over the German countryside because the German people were still fascinated by astrology. Rudolf Hess, of course, had famously flown to England, I believe it was May of 1940, in order to, make some sort of a connection with the British, the fascist element within the British monarchy. And he timed his flight according to astrological principles, and that gave Hitler the excuse to basically ban astrology in the Third Reich and have all the astrologers arrested, all the occultists arrested, thrown into the camps, and then slowly but surely weed them out and pick out the ones he liked, right? So Himmler saved, his astrologer from the camps, Wilhelm Wolff, and other people were taken out and given special remote viewing responsibilities or other occult responsibilities as time went on. So there was a cult war, as I wrote about in Unholy Alliance, a kind of cult war between the Nazis, who were occultists, and then the other cultists who were anti-Nazi within Germany itself. And then the British got involved, and then the British intelligence services hired people like Dennis Wheatley, who became a very famous novelist, an occult novelist, and Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming and Dennis Wheatley were part of the same unit of British intelligence, and then they went and hired Aleister Crowley. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Right. So Aleister Crowley, the most, this famous magician, the guy who created an entire movement around himself, was actually handpicked by British intelligence, saying, "Well, you have a lot of friends in Germany, and you belong to the OTO, which was started in Germany, and all this other stuff. You must know a lot of people. You must know how they think. What can we do to, get the cultists to go up against the Third Reich?" So he was seconded to British intelligence for a while. They were toying with using him as well. So you had Dennis Wheatley, Ian Fleming, and Aleister Crowley all in the same room at one point. Isn't that phenomenal?
That's amazing.
So you have the James Bond creator, the Dennis Wheatley, Aleister Crowley. Oh, and they're all hanging out there saying, "What can we do to destroy Hitler?"
It's so funny because I've always loved like the Indiana Jones movies, especially the stuff where they bring the Nazis into the storyline, and I always find that fascinating. I mean, how accurate do you think those movies were, and how soon after Nazi Germany went down did some of these stories start coming out where people were knowledgeable of the occult connection to Hitler and the Nazi Germans? It was right?
Not too much after. I mean, it was coming out in drips and drabs, but it really hit in 1960 when the two French authors, Pauwels and Bergier, wrote Le Matin des Musiciens, which is The Morning of the Magicians. That book was a bestseller all over the world. It was a bestseller in Europe, in France. It went through dozens and dozens of printings, and then it became The Morning of the Magicians in this country and in England, and it went through another couple of dozen printings. And this was the book that really put the idea of Nazi occultism on the map, because Pauwels and Bergier were French resistance fighters during the war. They had done a lot of research on their own in terms of things like alchemy, weird, scientific things that were being studied by the Allies during the war. So they wrote about that. They wrote about the Thule Gesellschaft. Sometimes it's probably the first time people had heard of the Thule Society, which was the occult secret society that was meeting in the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich in 1918 and 1919. It was really the Thule Society, with a secret society based on occult principles, which was also a kind of a German supremacist organization, right? An anti-communist organization that triggered, Hitler's emergence as a leader in what would become Nazi Germany. In 1918 and 1918 is the end of World War I. Right. Germany has been humiliated. They've been defeated. And there's this secret society meeting in this hotel in Munich. And at one point, the city of Munich is being invaded by communist soldiers. I mean, Germans who then joined the Communist Party after the Russian Revolution. So now they're communists. They're the Reds, as they call them. And they were coming into the city, and they were going to take over Munich. Well, they raided the offices of the Thule Society. They took everyone out up against a wall and shot them, murdered them. And that was April 30th of 1919. Again, April 30th shows up.
Right.
So they're murdered, and that ignited a revolt in Munich against the Reds. So the Thule Gesellschaft, this secret society, the Thule Society, an occult secret society, is then marching in the streets with machine guns, right? And they're fighting the communists in the streets, in street-to-street, building-to-building battle. And then they're joined by other forces, including the Stahlhelm Freikorps. A Freikorps is like a militia. Basically, we would call it a militia in this country. So this militia comes in, and they have helmets, the famous Nazi sort of helmet, the Wehrmacht-style helmet, with swastikas inscribed on them. This is in 1919 already. And the swastika was the emblem of the Thule Society. That was their symbol.
Right.
It was a swastika over a dagger with oak leaves. That was their symbol. So now we have these groups marching into Munich wearing swastikas on their helmets. And Hitler is in the middle of all of this because he's sent now to investigate what's going on with the Thule Society and with something called the German Workers' Party, which then, of course, he turns into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the rest is history. That becomes the Nazi Party. So this is all part of this. I mean, it was a secret society in Munich that started this. It was an occult society that really started this immense backlash against communism in Germany. And then Munich showed the rest of Germany how to do it. We get rid of communists the old-fashioned way. We murder them, basically. So that's what that was all about. I mean, that's how Hitler, cut his milk teeth on rabble-rousing and revolt against the establishment and all of this. This was because of a secret society, because the members of the Thule Society were quite often the same people who were members of the German Workers' Party. They had they met in the same hotel, in the same place, in the same rooms. I mean, it was all the same people. So it was like that. It was that weird. So occultism was there. Hitler's early days in Vienna were spent reading a magazine called Ostara. And Ostara is an occult magazine. It was run by a guy called Lanz von Liebenfels, who was a former Catholic priest and monk, who then left to form his own group called the Order of New Templars. And he had his own magazine, Ostara, which was anti-Semitic rag, basically, showing the Jews as being this savage, undisciplined, spiritually inferior race that was endangering, white Aryan German women, basically. So you had pictures of people who looked like Charlie Manson, going up against these tall Nordic blonde types. So, this was a standard fare with a lot of, pseudo, philosophical, religious, occult stuff thrown in there and all sorts of speculations about New Age stuff. And Hitler devoured these things. He devoured Ostara. He loved it. I mean, he was a lover of Wagner.
Right.
And this is all straight out of Wagner too. This guy, idolized Wagner. He would stand through the ring cycle because he couldn't afford a seat to sit down, so he paid the cheapest ticket just so that he could stand and listen to Wagner. Anyone who's heard the ring cycle, we're talking about 30 hours of opera there.
Oh my goodness.
And this is how fanatic that he was. So the idea of symbolism and display and ritual was very much part of Hitler's makeup. I don't believe he was an occultist in any way, shape, or form, and I make that point clear in my own writings. I don't believe he belonged to any cult or anything like that. He would never have wanted to join a club that would have him as a member, you know what I mean? But he had Himmler for that. Himmler was the occultist. Himmler was the cultist. He was the guy who was going to do all the ritual stuff and, do all this other weird stuff that Hitler loved, he was interested in, and he loved to talk about it.
I mean, you talk about symbology. I mean, just the use of the swastika, which goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Oh,
I mean,
that was
symbol.
A sacred symbol. And
that
the
symbol.
Nazis just turned it into this horrible symbol of hate, and it was never meant to be that, ever.
That symbol will never recover. Like, that's the redeemable symbol. I mean, you can't bring that back and make it nice and fluffy again, because that's it. It's tainted forever because of Hitler. And
you're absolutely right. That's what happened. And anybody who doubts that the Nazi Party was a cult, all they have to do is look at that symbol.
Yeah.
That tells you the whole story right there. You can't walk away and say it was a political party like any political party. It obviously wasn't.
Clearly wasn't. Peter, we're almost out of time. I can't believe the time flies so quickly on these shows. We've got to have you back on the show.
Yeah, the show was a lot quicker than usual.
Peter, are you going to give any speeches in the near future? Going to be anywhere that you want to promote real quick for anybody who's listening and who follows your work and should follow your work?
No speeches necessarily. I'm going to be on some podcasts in the next few weeks and stuff that's going to be going on. But for the most part, though, my book, Lovecraft Code, is coming out a month from today. And that's a novel. But it involves the Middle East. It involves Lovecraft. It involves mysticism, occultism, you could say. It involves a lot of weird cults in the Middle East. And a lot of other stuff that you wouldn't expect to find in a novel like that. I finally am publishing a novel. I've been writing novels for years, but I finally am publishing this one because I think it's really, it's about what's going on today in a lot of ways, but it puts it in a kind of an occult perspective. So something people might want to read, because the Lovecraft stuff dovetails very neatly with what's going on in the Middle East and around the world with cults and the resurgence in cultic activity, and I view the terrorist groups as cults basically, and so this is something that I'm writing about in the Lovecraft Code. So have a look.
Look, we're only a few days away, so I'm going to ask you, what do you think, Trump or Hillary?
You expect me to answer that?
Come on, have on air, no pressure, no pressure.
Well, there's another party I like. It's called the Cthulhu for America Party. I'm looking at that.
That's what I'm talking about. There you go, Peter.
I like their slogan. It's no more years.
Peter, you're awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of the show here tonight with us and partaking on an hour here on Skywatchers Radio. And we definitely have to have you back on soon, because the time just flew by, man. It was a lot of fun having you here with us. I
had a lot of fun myself. Thanks a lot, guys.
What's your website address? I forgot completely to ask you.
It's basically just my name. It's www.peterlevenda.com. And Levenda is spelled L-E-V as in Victor, E-N-D-A. So it's peterlevenda.com.
peterlevenda.com. There you go. Again, guys, we'll be back next week with another fascinating episode here on Skywatchers Radio. Who do we have next week? Crystal, do you know? Any idea? No?
Off the top. I know that we have a lot of guests booked up until
That's
December.
An easy
and
answer.
Because we've run a couple of reruns, we probably have them booked up until January. That's what I know. I know that you want to be here every Tuesday night listening to our fascinating guests.
Now, next week we have a gentleman straight off the ranch. James Gilliland is going to be here with us on Skywatchers Radio. So stick around for that next week. That's going to be a whole lot of fun. Still, like always, I say, keep your eyes to the skies, keep paying attention to what's going on around you, and by all means, vote for Trump.